Welcome to the Holistic Accountant Podcast. This is where we cut through conventional accounting and show you how a genuinely holistic approach drives better after-tax outcomes. It's not about ticking boxes or churning out tax returns. It's about strategic advice that builds lasting wealth. If you find this episode valuable, leave a rating and share it with someone who will benefit. Now, when you're building a small business, sometimes you as the founder or owner can be the biggest bottleneck or the biggest impediment to achieving growth outcomes. And that's an obvious problem. When you're building a business, particularly at the beginning, you're the responsibility for almost everything in that business falls on your shoulders. So, there's going to be times where all you feel like you're doing is putting out spot fires. But if that's the case on a protracted basis, so that it doesn't get better or easier, it's a symptom that you're not hiring properly, you're not delegating, you're not actually building a business. All you've done is built a job for yourself, and it's not a particularly enjoyable job. So what today, Mena and I want to talk about is how do you navigate that process? How do you identify whether you are actually the bottleneck in your business, and how do you put that cost in context of, achieving your wider growth plans?
And I'm going to be a bit hypocritical here because I remember when I started out first as a leader or a business owner that I always used to think, oh, it's just faster if I do it, right? Because it's just easier. I'll do it right. I don't have to show someone, and it'll just be nice and easy and quick if I do it. But that's really how you stay small. You can't achieve any scale if you're always going to be that bottleneck in your own business. So it's really important to step away from this. I know a few podcasts back, I can't remember the podcast episode name, but we spoke about the sabbatical stress test in your business. So if you were to step away from your business, how well would it actually run? What would actually break in your business? Now, as a leader, if you're constantly doing these things that are going to be the quick fixes in your business because you're the knowledge and you're the know-how, then you're going to basically create a chronic issue of your staff always escalating issues to you to fix. You're basically creating an environment where all the staff will have no ability to problem solve. They're just going to rely on you to solve every single problem in your business. Now, that will just make you, like I said, like Stuart mentioned before, is to basically just have a job. You're going to get no financial freedom. You're going to get no sort of time to yourself. You're only going to reflect on your business and on the mundane tasks that are involved in your business.
It's good to start thinking about your hourly rate because not everything you do in your business has the same value per hour. And that's what you really want to think about. And I guess we can probably put work into 4 categories. Strategic decisions or strategic planning, revenue driving activities. So that's really bringing money in the door. That's talking to new clients or working on a marketing strategy. Management decisions, which is really managing the internal machinations of your business. So, leading team meetings, giving feedback, training, and then admin execution. And I guess, no prizes for guessing which one I'm going to focus on because, if there's low value repeatable work, that's typically falls in admin execution. Founders shouldn't be doing that. I spoke about Dave Ramsey last week, which again is a US entrepreneur trainer. He says that he only works on 3 things in his business: big things, broken things, and new things. And it really resonated with me. I thought that's kind of really smart because he's come up with a very clear and very simple to understand kind of methodology on what he does work on, but most importantly, what he doesn't work on. If it's not broken, if it's not big and it's not new, he doesn't want to know about it. At the end of the day, he's hired people in his business to look after those things so that he can then work on those other things. One of the challenges with, particularly for new business owners, is that what we're talking about here is structured work versus unstructured work. So management and managing the internal machinations of your business and strategic decisions, that's very unstructured. Whereas revenue driving and admin execution can be typically more structured. I need to make these sales calls. I want to contact this customer or client that's been doing a lot of business with us, or I need to do these admin tasks. So quite often as business owners, we get sucked into that structured work just because it's emotionally easier. We know what to do. It's a very deliberate process, a very stepped out process, but that's not always the right thing that we should be focusing on. And so it really is good to start thinking about value per hour. and where are you going to deliver the most value per hour? Maybe if you're in a scaling stage, maybe the number one thing you should be doing is just bringing more revenue in through the door. Or if you're, transitioning strategically, maybe that's where you need to be sort of focused on, particularly if your industry's changing or your product's changing or something like that. But again, thinking about value per hour is critical here.
And when you delegate, I think it's really important to delegate the decision rights that come along with it. Now, as a starting out business, establishing that trust is really difficult at the start to make sure that the process is going to, or the work is actually going to be done. So it's really important for you to be able to step away from that task. Trust that the employee would actually take ownership of the task, as I say. When you instill a staff member with that kind of responsibility, generally, if they're the right people, they'll run with it. But that doesn't mean that you step away from it in its entirety. It's really important to, like we mentioned in our last podcast, to establish that cadence around the checking in, around whether there could be any process improvements. As I always say, two heads are better than one. So what you might have established as a process for that task might not be the best way to do it, but that staff member might have a better idea. So it's really important to help encourage that conversation and then have confidence in that delegation, because you shouldn't be involved in those administrative tasks anymore, as Stuart mentioned. But if you create unclear authority, it really slows down your team. You're going to create that bottleneck, like I mentioned before. So it's really important that you give that ownership to the staff members, and the right people will do the right things by you.
And delegation needs to have guardrails. You just can't say, well, this is now your responsibility. Good luck with it, and never hear from them again. Never talk about, that particular thing with them ever again. Of course, that's silly. At the end of the day, it's your business. You take responsibility for its outcomes. But delegating sensibly and with the right guardrails really just means educating the team member on what decisions they've got the capacity and authority to make within, what sort of sphere. So when should they escalate decisions? And then if there's quite a bit of judgment in executing the task that you've delegated to them, then what you really need to do is build that into the training. And you can do that in a couple of different ways. You can do it by coming up with a decision tree in terms of saying, well, if this looks like this, then this is what your decision should be. But if it looks like that, then you've got to go the other way. And so sometimes you can map these things out in a decision tree. Quite often we feel like things with judgment just require a lot of experience. And this is the problem, right? Because it always then rests with the founder, because the founder typically has the most experience in the business. But quite often you can pull it apart into a decision tree, and ChatGPT or one of the large language models would probably be one of the best tools around now that can help you do that. Plus also on the job training, I think probably decision tree and on the job training together, it makes sense again with tasks with a lot of judgment. So you can help people navigate kind of on the job decisions and share your experience, but also share past decisions as well, good and bad. So you can give them examples of, how the task was applied incorrectly and what the outcomes were. And again, what we're trying to look for here is patterns as human beings, and trying to help people and train people to make decisions within certain parameters. Now, of course, if they start falling outside those parameters, they start to become really big ticket decisions, for instance, then that's what you want them to delegate and escalate that to you, the business owner or the manager. I don't think it's a case necessarily of never making a mistake. And, mistakes will happen. We're all human beings, particularly with tasks that do require quite a bit of judgment. But you want to make sure you've got a very tight feedback loop so that you can kind of iterate and course correct and train on the job to improve outcomes. If you're delegating in a way that has zero expectations of mistakes, that's going to be a challenge. It's always a challenge in every business. You want to minimize them, of course, but it's really about designing a process that has robust training to begin with, good guardrails, and a strong feedback loop.
So I guess the question then becomes, what do you first sort of hand off to your staff to delegate? Now, what I've always found is that the highly sort of process-driven tasks are the best things to start out with. Hand off any sort of repeatable tasks where it's what I like to call checkbox items. So things that they can just go follow a set of steps to ensure that that work process is done. And then what I typically like to do is then put someone in place to make sure that that staff member is actually completing those tasks. So put a leader in place as such, or a manager in place. So in this way, you've got two people to hold accountable for the actual task or job. It keeps work basically safe in that regard, and it allows you to sort of ascertain what workloads would actually look like and free up a whole lot of your time on these mundane tasks. Now, as Stuart mentioned, what you'd really retain as an owner or a leader in your business is basically the things that are new, the ones that are broken, or the things that need sort of to have a big decision input or a big input from yourself as the owner.
I mean, let's be honest about what bad delegation looks like. Bad delegation is very vague. There's not clear inputs in terms of this is what you need to make the decision or this is what you need to complete the task. There's no definition of done. What does done look like? That's a really important thing. How do we know when we're finished? Again, typically when we delegate something and if it's not completed to the standard we were looking for, typically it's lack of communication, as we were speaking about in last week's episode. So make sure that you've got the right training and process. So you've got the right processes, you've got the right template, you've got the right systems, and that someone can actually follow a mapped out sort of standard operating procedure, and they clearly understand what's required of them, when they're able to make a decision and what done looks like, what they're actually taking responsibility for. The next thing you want to think about then is getting a return on your investment. The whole idea is that as you delegate tasks, it should free up more and more of your time. Again, you might be spending time like Dave Ramsey on the broken things, the big things, or the new things. But the whole idea is that you've got more and more time to yourself to spend on those other things. So track what the return on investment is. Is it actually working? Or do you still get a whole bunch of questions? Or is the person reluctant to make a decision without, communicating with you? That might be okay initially, but you've got to start seeing, some time saving mechanisms. You want to make sure you're empowering your team members as well. They've got to realize they might make mistakes. That's okay. It's part of the job. But again, we have that very short feedback loop so that we can kind of course correct. But if you aren't finding the time saving, then it's most likely a system issue, a communication, or a training issue that you haven't had a clear handover of that delegation. And sometimes it's like, feels like one step backwards for two steps forward, because you think, I'm already too busy. That's why I want to delegate this stuff. And now I've got to go and prepare a checklist or record a video, to sort of walk people through the process. And it is a little bit like that. But, investing that time, as Mena says, sometimes we're very eager to just think, oh, well, if I do it, it'll be done quicker, it'll be done right. But that's not really the way we're going to move forward in our business.
Now, a big mistake I find businesses do is actually throw more people at the problem. Now, what adding people does to a sort of a founder-centric or sort of single point sensitive business is you're actually creating more complexity than anything else, because you're creating more staff, more messages, more approvals, or more problem-solving issues that rely on the founder. So you're basically just creating a further bottleneck as such. So it's really important to actually understand your business, understand the system, understand the processes before you start throwing people at the problem. A lot of businesses can actually look a lot bigger than what they actually are. So, there's businesses that have more staff than what they need to have and are running on much leaner margins and are much more fragile because owners are just putting people at the issue. So it's really important to understand where you can actually gain efficiencies in your business. And you won't actually be able to do this without understanding what roles you can delegate, what systems and processes you can put in place to help the delegation process, and how you can actually free up your time.
So I guess what we'd like to ask you to think about after listening to this episode are, what are the things that you can delegate? Where's the low-hanging fruit in terms of saving you time so that you can work on the big things, the broken things, or the new things? Now, the obvious reaction might be, okay, I'm going to just start delegating 20 things a week. And in fact, if you can do that, fantastic, good on you. But I find the best approach is to consistently ask yourself, every time you go and do a task or do something at work, ask yourself, is there a way I can delegate this so I never have to do this task again? And then start making a list, because practically it's probably just not practical to, delegate every single task that you come up against. But if you can start building a list of all the things that you want to delegate and then build a cadence around it, maybe delegate one thing a day, or if that's too much, a couple of things a week, whatever it is. Sometimes we overestimate what we can do, or often we overestimate what we can do in a short period of time, but we grossly underestimate what we can do in a longer period of time, like a month or a quarter or so forth. So I think just break it up into palatable sizes, delegating maybe one thing a week, for instance. And if you do that over the course of the next year, you've delegated 52 things, and I guarantee it will absolutely change your workload. It's just about identifying those things. So having the discipline to every single time ask, am I the right person to do this? If not, add it to the list, and then gradually chip away at it, build those systems. And not only, as I said, do you build a more robust business that's more sustainable, that's less reliant on you, the key person, but ultimately you get to spend more time doing the work that you enjoy. Okay, we'll leave it there for this week. Until next week, bye for now.